Hi everybody, welcome to today's story time. We are reading the book A Mirror of Miracles, and it's the third book in the Universal series, and we're on chapter 4, Mirror of Miracles. Hugh lay still in his bed as he watched the seconds tick by on his clock, waiting eagerly for morning to arrive. He rolled over and let out a sigh. What's taking so long, he thought, as he stared up at his vision wall. There was a crack as his door slowly began to open. Hugh lifted his head and looked at the bottom of his bed to see Molly's head peering around the door. Are you awake? Molly whispered. I can't sleep, he replied, sitting up. Me neither, Molly said, navigating her way through Hugh's room and sitting down on his bed. Molly glanced over at the vision wall. I wonder what is waiting for us at the bottom of the mountain, Molly muttered, lost in thought. Whatever it is, it's sure to have one result. To make life even more fun and for us to succeed, and we can receive everything that we wish for. Hugh sat looking at Molly with a cheeky smile. What is it like having Ben as your new dad? Molly asked, secretly feeling upset by what was about to happen in her own life. Hugh looked straight at her. It's no better or worse, it's just different. My dad brought one perspective on life and Ben brings a different perspective, and I love them both for that, Hugh said. Are you sure you're all right about what is happening with your parents? Hugh asked, concerned. Molly lifted out the locket and held it in her hand. I guess it stinks, but part of me feels there is something better on its way. I've just got to get there. The atmosphere in the house has been horrible the last couple of months, so at least I won't have that when I go back. I just want to find my home, Molly said, shuffling her feet together as the fear began to rise inside. Molly looked up quickly, changing the subject. So, which one of your pictures is next to come true? She asked. Hugh whipped back the duvet and stood up on his bed, pointing to the picture with the words written on it. World's greatest champion, #1. Hugh looked at Molly, beaming. It's going to be the best day ever, he said, sitting back down on his bed. The room started to get lighter as the sun rose up over the hills. Hugh watched as the room glowed golden. He got down off his bed and went to the bottom of his wardrobe. Pulling out a rucksack, he darted around the room and filled it with his camera, jumper and PJs. He sneaked out of his room and into the bathroom, coming back with his toothbrush and placing it in his rucksack. Molly sat down, hugging her knees as tears started to roll down her cheeks. Hugh zipped up his bag as he looked over towards Molly. He walked across and sat down next to her, wrapping his arms around her. It's okay, Molly. It'll be okay. You still have me, Hugh said hopefully. Molly sniffled. I do know it's going to be okay, she said as more tears flowed, because it's only change, and that means you have a say in what change transforms into, Hugh said, smiling and squeezing Molly tighter. But nobody listens to me. I'm invisible, she cried. Ben appeared at the door and Hugh looked up pleadingly for Ben to make it all better. Ben sat down next to Molly on the bed and lifted her onto his lap. He wrapped his arms around her and she sat motionless with her head tucked into his neck. Molly, you're such an important person in this life. You may just feel like a speck of stardust in the vast universe at the moment, but without you, the universe would be incomplete. There would be a very important piece missing, Ben said, holding her tight. Molly looked up and Hugh passed her one of his socks to use as she wiped away her snot. I guess, Molly said, looking down at her fingers. Ben leaned back. You guess? Well, I know for sure. Life would be incomplete without you. Hugh, everyone, Ben said with feeling. As we flow down the river of life, there will be times when we have a bumpy ride through the rapids, and it's those times that we have to remember not to bail out on our hopes and dreams, but let those rapids make us stronger, Ben said as he kissed Molly on the forehead. We all still love you, and you'll always have a family. You'll have just a few extra members than most, and there will always be room here for you, Ben said, lifting her onto the bed and standing up. Molly looked up and nodded and began to smile as she started to feel more optimistic. Come on, Molly, let's get your stuff ready, Hugh said, climbing off the bed and taking her hand. Ben stepped back out of the way. I'll be in the barn getting things ready for Tom's arrival, he said. Hugh looked back with gratitude. Ben nodded and smiled in acknowledgement before following them out onto the landing. As Ben skipped down the stairs, he could hear Hugh whirling around Molly's room. Ben walked into the kitchen as he began to make Ali her morning cup of tea and a fresh pot of coffee. There was a thunder of feet as Hugh and Molly bounded down the stairs across the living room and towards the front door. "We'll come and help you, Ben," Molly said as she slipped on her boots. Hugh opened the front door and there, straight in front of him, were 2 butterflies sitting on the porch light. "Ben, Molly, come quick," he whispered, motionless. Ben became curious and walked over, holding Ali's cup of tea. Molly looked up and saw the butterflies too. The butterflies were pure white. They fluttered their wings momentarily before becoming still again. Ben reached the door and saw them. "They're an omen, aren't they?" Hugh said in awe, turning and looking at Ben. "Hugh, sometimes I think you're on another planet," Molly said, looking confused. "Some say the butterfly is there to remind us to move through transitions and transformation with lightness and playfulness." "But I've never seen 2 together like this before," Ben said, looking down at Hugh and Molly in front of him. "Oh boy," Ben said in anticipation of what was to come. He turned and headed back towards the stairs. Hugh's smile transformed into a large grin as he bounced up and down in front of Molly. Molly placed her hands on his shoulders, trying to keep his feet on the ground before they floated away with joy. "Just hold on, what is this all about?" Molly asked, shaking her head. "Whoop, whoop, yippee!" Hugh yelled as he ran across towards the barn with his arms spread wide like he was a bird flying through the sky. "Hey, wait for me!" Molly called as she ran behind him. As she reached the barn, she saw Hugh scooping out some grain and placing it in buckets. "So, are you going to tell me what it means?" Molly asked, walking over and picking up one of the buckets. "I don't need to. Ben has already. Don't you see? The butterflies were for both of us, and they are there to remind us that whatever happens today, we need to be playful and light-hearted about it," Hugh said, breathless. He picked up the buckets and made his way out to the horses. "That was just a coincidence," Molly said dismissively as she walked to the first gate and placed the bucket inside the pen. Hugh stopped in his tracks. "Seriously," he said, looking very impressed. "After all you have learnt from the locket and my wall, you think that is a coincidence," he said, feeling disappointed as he walked to the next horse and placed the bucket in front of it. Molly shuffled her feet in the dirt. "I guess not," she said. Hugh placed the last bucket down and walked back towards Molly. "You know this. 2 events coinciding is a coincidence. What are the chances of us ever seeing something like that again?" Hugh continued. "It doesn't change what it is to come, but it is there to help us to create the best day we can out of what we have at the moment," Hugh finished. Molly stood boldly in front of Hugh. "The best we have got at the moment?" she erupted. "Did you not hear what's happening in my life? My whole world is splitting in 2, she yelled, bursting into tears again. "When are you going to start telling a new story?" Hugh said, shaking his head. "You see 2 worlds splitting in 2. I see an opportunity to create your own world," he said as he walked by Molly and headed back into the barn. Molly listened to the horses munching on their grain. As she ran her fingers along the silk-like fur, a bubbly feeling began to rise from the pit of her stomach. "Is he always right?" she muttered in jest to the horses, before heading back to the barn. She was greeted by Ben, who was emptying sacks of grain. "He has gone to get some breakfast before we head off," Ben said, as he picked up another sack and began emptying it. Molly nodded as she started to walk past. "You never know, Molly. Your life could transform into something incredible. When you think you have lost everything, that is the moment when you receive what your heart has always wanted," Ben said wisely. Molly stopped and looked back at Ben. "Sometimes I think you're just a walking bumper sticker dispenser," she said as she continued to make her way towards the house. Ben began to chuckle. "Well, that's a new one," he muttered to himself. Molly slowly opened the front door and stepped inside, as she looked over to see Ali, Hugh and her parents sitting at the kitchen table. Ali got up. "Breakfast is on the table," she said, motioning for Molly to come and join them. Molly slipped off her boots, walked across to the table, sat down and reached for a pancake. Hugh continued to look down as he couldn't hide his disappointment in Molly not believing in the butterflies. Molly stared at Hugh and then turned to Ali. "We saw 2 white butterflies this morning. Ben said they're an omen for transformation," Molly said, proving a point to Hugh. Ali sat back down at the table and picked up her cup of tea. When I first arrived, I thought that was crazy talk, but now, she paused. Now I believe it's to be the truth, she said. I think this trip has a gift for all of us, Molly said as she took a mouthful of pancake. Maybe I'll transform into a beautiful butterfly, Molly said, looking at Ali. Sometimes a butterfly just needs to spread its wings and fly, shining its colours for all to admire, Ali said, winking at Molly. Hugh sat with his mouth wide open as he couldn't believe what his mum had just said. Are you trying to pretend to be a flycatcher? Ali said jokingly to Hugh. Just then the door opened and Ben walked in. Is everything ready to load up as Tom's just arrived? He said with perfect timing. Tom stepped through the door. Morning, everyone, he said, tipping his hat. Morning, Tom. Coffee? Ali asked as she got up and walked towards the coffee machine. Tom sat down next to Hugh before reaching forward and taking some of his pancake. Hey! Hugh protested. Ali looked at Hugh. You go and help take the bags to the truck with Ben, Ali instructed as she placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of Tom. And you, behave yourself, she said, tapping Tom on the shoulder. Hugh slid his chair back and stuck his tongue out at Tom as he went by. Hugh began dragging the bag across to the front door, and Ben then took them down to the truck. Looks like you're going to have nice weather for your trip, Tom said as he drank his coffee. Yes, thankfully, but we are making a stop on our way to see the man at the bottom of the mountain, whatever that means, Ali said, mystified. Tom blurted out his mouthful of coffee and sprayed everyone. Ben and Hugh walked back in. Tom shot round and looked at Ben, ready to interrogate. So, you are going to the mountain, Ali says. Ben froze. I think I left a bag upstairs, he said with a mischievous smile as he suddenly dashed towards the staircase. Tom smirked as he drank the remainder of his coffee. Ali watched them both. This is getting more and more suspicious, and one of you is going to tell me what the heck is going on, or you'll both be sleeping in the barn, she said, standing up. Tom stood up too. I'll let Ben do the talking. He seems to be good at that, he said. Tom tipped his hat and then made his way towards the front door as Ben reappeared in the living room. Tom pointed towards him. When you get back, we're doing some roping practice, he announced before heading out towards the barn. Ben turned towards everyone. They were still bemused by his actions. Ready when you guys are, he said before turning and heading out to the truck. Ali got up and began to tidy the pots. Leave those and get off. I'll do them, Molly's mum said, taking the plates off Ali. Are you sure? I don't mind, Ali said. Go on, have a great trip, Molly's mum said, motioning for her to head to the door. Ali reached over and gave her a big hug. Stay strong, she whispered. Molly walked across. See you when I get back, she said, feeling sad. Molly's mum wrapped her in a hug. Have a great time, she said as she kissed her on the cheek. Molly walked across to her dad and climbed on his lap. See you soon, she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. In a while, crocodile, he said, hugging her back. Molly climbed down and walked across to where Ali was waiting. She pulled on her boots and together they headed out towards the truck where Hugh and Ben were waiting. Molly and Ali climbed into the truck as Ben began to reverse. Molly's parents stood at the front door waving. Molly watched them through the rear view window and drove off down the dirt road. As they drove along, Molly continued to watch the world pass by out the rear window. Hugh sat restless in the back seat next to her, eager to get to the mountain. Ben looked across at Ali, who was nervously tapping his fingers on her lap. She looked over at Ben. You just might as well tell me who we're going to see, she said, frustrated. Ben smiled and looked back at the road. I did. The man at the bottom of the mountain, he said, delighted with himself. Ali slid further down in her seat. Molly turned round to face the front and tried to feel excited. Instead, she felt throbbing pain inside as her life shattering to pieces was too loud. Ben glanced at Molly in the rearview mirror with concern. He reached forwards and turned on the radio in an attempt to distract her from her thoughts. Molly looked at Ben and gave him a weak smile of gratitude. Please, life, let him be able to help Molly and Hugh, Ben thought to himself. As the mountain drew rapidly closer and the roads began to bend and twirl around the rolling hills, Ali became engrossed in the breathtaking landscape. It's beautiful, Ali said to herself. Ben slowed down the truck as they passed through a small town. Hugh pressed his face against the window as he watched the stores pass by. Ben looked from side to side as the memories of the past began to emerge from deep inside. Some he wished he could forget. He reached a stoplight and turned right, heading back out of the town and into the countryside. As the buildings began to grow smaller, Ben turned left down a small road. Ali pulled herself up and sat bolt upright, her eyes fixed on a small house that lay ahead, overlooked by the mountain. Ben parked the truck in front of a small log cabin. As he parked up, he took a deep breath in. I really hope he's in a good mood, he thought to himself, before opening the door and stepping out into the fresh mountain air. Ali sat motionless. The unknown still scared her as she looked around for any signs of life. She watched Ben walk up the steps and knock on the front door. Ben stood staring at his feet as he shuffled uncomfortably from side to side. Why is Ben nervous, Mum? Hugh asked, watching Ben intently. Not sure, but it's making me nervous, Ali said as her heart began to race. Hugh reached for the door handle just as the cabin door opened. There stood a tall, thin man dressed similar to Ben, but with grey hair and wrinkles etched into his skin. They both stood for a moment staring at each other before the man disappeared back into the house, followed by Ben. Should we follow? Hugh asked impatiently. I don't know, Ali said, feeling vulnerable and frozen by her fear. Molly quickly opened the door and ran up the stairs into the house. She couldn't cope with the indecisiveness right now. Ali and Hugh soon followed. They stepped through the front door of the simple log cabin, with only the bare essentials, a chair positioned by the fire, a bookshelf in the corner, and a dining table. Ali and Hugh and Molly nervously walked through towards the back of the house and reached the kitchen. They looked around for signs of either Ben or the man. Molly looked around. Where are the photos? She whispered to Hugh, who shrugged in response. Ali reached to take the handle of the back door and it flew open. Ali stepped back just in time. The man screeched to a halt, staring wild-eyed at Ali, who glared at him. Ben stepped out from behind. Meet my pa, he said, sinking his hands deep into his jean pockets. Pa, this is Ali, Hugh and Molly, Ben said tentatively. The man looked them up and down antagonistically, nodded in acknowledgement and stepped around Ali towards the living room. He paused a moment when he reached Molly and Hugh and then continued heading towards his chair. He sat down, placed his elbows on the armrests and clasped his fingers together. Ben stepped towards Ali, speechless. I'll put the kettle on, Molly said, trying to lighten the atmosphere. Hugh spun round and walked towards the man, bringing one of the dining table chairs and placing it in front of him. The man's focus didn't shift from the floor. Hi, I'm Hugh, he said, holding out his hand. The man took a deep breath. Billy, he replied, taking Hugh's hand and shaking it. Ali glared at Ben. A little warning would have been nice, she said. Ben took her hand. I wasn't sure if he would be here, Ben said, guiding Ali into the living room and sitting down at the table. Molly started to bring in the cups of tea and a coffee for Ben. What do you want, mister? Molly said rudely. Billy looked up at her with his hands placed on her hips and grunted. Coffee. Molly disappeared back into the kitchen and the room fell silent. Billy looked across to Ben as Molly reappeared with a cup of coffee, handing it to Billy. Billy looked down and noticed a locket around her neck. Molly perched on Hugh's seat and stared intensely at Billy. Why don't you have any family photos? She asked boldly. Ben shuffled nervously in his seat. Billy looked up at Ben. Nice to know I've been a big part of your life story, he said sarcastically. Ben became angry. You would have been, had you not spent your life as the walking dead the moment Grandma and Grandpa died, Ben said, standing up and storming out of the back door. Billy went back to staring at his coffee. Hugh took the opportunity. You have some information for me and Molly, he said, folding his arms across his chest. Hugh, not now, Ali said, getting up to find Ben. Hugh watched Ali walk out the back door. When she had disappeared, he turned back to Billy. Yes, now, he said with authority. Yes, what he said, Molly said, folding her arms to mirror Hugh. No information here, Billy said, taking a gulp of coffee. You're lying, Molly interrupted. Your words aren't matching your intention, she said, pointing to his mouth and then his heart. Billy looked straight into Molly's eyes. Where did you get that locket from? He said, hard-heartedly. Molly quickly tucked the locket beneath her top. A piece of information for a piece of information, she said, refolding her arms. Billy began to smile. Your persistence will serve you well on your journey, he said, looking at Molly and then at Hugh. Most people don't ask or insist enough, he finished. Billy looked back towards the door. So what tales of misery has he told you? Billy asked, motioning towards where Ben went. Actually, he has only just mentioned you in the last couple of days. He wanted you to meet Mum for obvious reasons, Hugh said, beginning to relax. Billy looked back at Hugh. Well, I was beginning to think this day wouldn't come, Billy said, getting up and walking across to the bookshelf. He moved one of the books to the side, took out a small box and placed it in his shirt pocket. Did you know we were coming? Molly asked, turning round in her seat towards Billy. There have been signs, Billy remarked. Now, let's talk about that deal, young lady. You have the feistiness of a woman I once knew who had a very similar locket to that, Billy said as he walked across the living room to close the door. Molly and Hugh got up and followed Billy as he opened a door and stepped into a dark room. Billy reached across and turned on the light. Molly and Hugh stepped into the room cautiously. Billy walked over to where a blanket was pinned to the wall and pulled it down. There, hanging on the wall, was a mirror with writing inscribed on the top. Molly and Hugh stepped forward and examined the mirror as Billy wiped some dust off with the blanket. Billy then stood back. So, what have you learnt so far? Billy asked, staring at Hugh and Molly's reflection in the mirror. Hugh turned round. That once you say what you want and focus on it, then it will come true. That's how Mum and I met Ben, Hugh said. Billy nodded. Very good. The law of attraction. And you, miss? Billy said, gazing at Molly. Molly slowly turned round. That love connects us all, and our intuition is what guides us to the action we need to take to reach our dreams, Molly said quietly. Billy took a step forward. The law of oneness, he said as he placed his hands on Hugh's shoulder and turned him to face the mirror. Molly copied. Are you too sure you are ready for the next piece of the puzzle? By now you must know that once you understand this, life will never be the same again. There is no going back to who you were, he said guardedly. Yes, absolutely, Hugh said with delight. Billy looked at Molly. Molly looked him straight in the eye and nodded with conviction. The person you see in the mirror, you'll be, Billy said, placing his finger on the mirror. Hugh and Molly stared at their reflection. The question is, who do you see? Molly continued. Hugh tilted his head in confusion. I see my reflection, he said. Molly stood silently and then began to speak. I see a broken girl, lost, feeling homeless and unloved, with nothing going right in her life, she said as a tear began to roll down her cheeks. Hugh looked back at his reflection as he began to understand. I see a champion, the world's greatest, the number one, he said, smiling at his reflection. Then that's who you'll be, Billy said, stepping back. But I don't want to be that person, Molly turned round feeling angry. Billy placed his hand in his jeans pockets and his expression began to soften. Well, then change it, he said softly. Molly turned back and faced the mirror. But then I would be lying, saying I was something different, she responded. Billy stood behind Molly. Your life is only the stage of the role you have been playing, he said. Molly looked at herself again. I see hope. I see someone who is loved unconditionally, who has found her home, where her life is successful in every way, every day, she said. Then that is who you'll be, Billy said, pleased. Now, don't get caught out because the person you feel right now and the person you see in the mirror will constantly be trying to demand your attention. Just remember, it's your choice who you would like to see. Remind yourself, I believe in that which others may not yet see. Open your heart to be the person you want to be. This is a law of cause and effect, Billy concluded. Now, Miss Molly, a piece of information for a piece of information. You should always honour your word. It means you'll be careful choosing the words you speak and the promises you make in the future, Billy said powerfully. Molly turned round and unclasped the locket from around her neck before placing it in Billy's hand. Billy slowly opened it up and saw the piece of paper inside. He quickly closed it and handed it back to Molly. Thank you. he said before promptly walking out the room. Molly ran behind him. Billy sat back down in his chair, resting his elbows on the chair arm and clasping his fingers together. Molly sat down at the chair in front of him and gazed at him. Then she suddenly remembered. "Oh, my, you're him!" she exclaimed. Billy didn't move. "You're the man from the photo of Nannerl on one of her adventures," she continued to yell. Hugh quickly ran into the room to see an elated Molly. Billy continued to sit silently as Molly looked down at the locket in her hand. "Maybe you need this more than me," she said, holding it out towards Billy. Billy looked down at the locket and then slowly folded Molly's fingers back around it. "Just seeing it is enough for me to get the message. Your Nannerl was very good at saying clearly what she meant in very few words," he said as his eyes sparkled with life at the memory. "Keep hold of it. Let it continue to remind you of the truths you have already learnt on this journey," Billy said as he began to glow with joy. Molly reattached the locket around her neck. "I promise," she said, leaning across and hugging Billy. They heard the back door begin to open. Molly sat back up and was joined by Hugh, who then gave Billy a hug. "Thank you. Now I understand how I can reach my dreams," Hugh said. Ben appeared at the door of the kitchen. "We need to be making a move, you two," Ben said, looking longingly at Hugh and Molly. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Ben asked, calmly. They both nodded before standing up from their chair. "I hope we'll see you again," Hugh said, looking at Billy. "All you need to do is ask," Billy said quietly. Hugh took the chair and placed it back by the table and then walked with Molly out the front door. Ali walked into the living room. "Well, nice to meet you," she said coldly, holding out her hand towards Billy. Billy rose from his chair, walked across and took Ali's hand. "You sure are a miracle, Miss Ali," Billy said gladly. "Sorry about the rude introduction. It's just you were a bit of a surprise. I'd lost hope that this day would come," he finished. Ali looked at him confused. "I'll leave that story for Ben to tell some day. Now, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like a moment alone with my son," Billy said. Ali slowly began to make her way to the front door. As she looked back behind, Ben smiled sweetly and nodded that it was okay. Ali stepped outside and headed towards the truck where Molly and Hugh were waiting. Billy stepped towards Ben. He reached inside his pocket and took out the small box. He took hold of Ben's hand and placed it in his palm. "I hope you have as much eternal happiness, love and luck as your grandma and grandpa did," Billy said. Tears began to form in Billy's eyes. "I wish," he choked before stopping himself. Billy stepped forward and hugged Ben. "Me too. But they have got the best view of all. I'm sure they are happy we have seen each other again," Billy said tearfully. Ben was just about to speak, but Billy held up his hand to stop him. "Let's not let our past be the story of our future," he said. Ben nodded. "I best be going," he said, pointing to the front door. Billy nodded in agreement. "Have a safe journey, son," he said. Ben smiled, placed the box in his jean pockets and made his way out the front door. Ben skipped down the steps and hopped into the truck before turning on the ignition. The three in the truck all wondered at his sudden change in mood. "Right, Yellowstone, here we come," Ben said happily, as he turned the truck around and began to drive back down the road. I'll see you tomorrow for Chapter 4, Back to Truth.